Hey everybody, Eric Switzer here for The Gamer. Today we're talking about the new Elden Ring DLC, Shadows of the Erdtree. I'm joined by the two most maidenless gamers you'll ever meet, James Troughton
Hello.
and Jade King.
What up? I'm still maidenless. Let's go, Eric.
Okay, you both know that I am not the Souls boy. I'm not an Elden Ringer. But I'm happy for you. First of all, let me say that.
It's like when the new Kingdom Hearts comes out. You're like, I'm really happy for you.
Yeah, highest rated expansion of all time.
Damn.
Thanks to James, who specifically reviewed it a perfect score.
Yep.
How can this be? How can it here? Okay, here's my first question. Elden Ring, 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Shadows of the Erdtree. Wow, it's even better. How did they do that? Also 10 out of 10? Like,
Yeah.
what does our scale even mean?
We can't uproot the scoring system, I guess. But I guess it's like it when it comes. So for context, I reviewed Elden Ring for The Gamer. Gave it 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5 at the time because I think I considered it very much the magnum opus of what FromSoftware has been building to since Demon's Souls came out in 2009. It feels like they iterate upon elements that are in Dark Souls, Sekiro, Bloodborne, and all of that stuff, and it comes together in this open world that, bar Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, is probably one of the most accomplished fantasy landscapes that we've ever had. And speaking to James throughout the review period for this, Shadow of the Erdtree intimately recognizes the fact that it is a follow-up to Elden Ring. You can see that in how it addresses a lot of its mechanics, its boss battles, and so many things throughout, where they're like, okay, people are going to have high expectations for this, and they're going to come in and want more Elden Ring, but that's kind of not all what they're going to want. And I think coming away, I haven't finished it yet, for context, the DLC, but James has. There's like a density and a verticality and a confidence in this expansion that Elden Ring didn't need when you look at what the base game was and how much people love it, but it still has that, and it's very, very impressive. Obviously, I've spoken to like you before, Eric, and Stacey and stuff before, where it's once again not a game for everyone, but it is a game I could happily recommend to anyone in the broadest of terms.
Mm-hmm.
I think, speaking of my score specifically, I'd consider Elden Ring in the same sort of ballpark I would Dark Souls. I think it's a flawed masterpiece.
Yeah, I'm
I
complete
think
agreement.
Dark Souls' back half isn't good. I don't think it holds up. I don't think it was great at the time, but I still think the overall game's a 10 out of 10. I think Elden Ring, similarly, the open world has a lot of problems, a lot of faults, but the overall experience is a 10 out of 10. I think Shadow of the Erdtree perfects the open world, so it takes everything that was wrong with Elden Ring, everything that they kind of struggled with moving to a completely new style of game, and perfect it. I think the open world, the problem I think with Elden Ring is it was so empty at places. You'd have the same ruins, the same caves, the same dungeons, and it was just sort of really repetitive in every single zone. And I think Shadow of the Erdtree, everything feels unique, everything feels purposeful, and I think that's what was lacking.
I think in Erdtree almost, they have less to work with in terms of the scale of the map and the amount of content. But as a consequence, I think focusing down that vision gives them more to work with and more spaces to put that imagination, so they're not sometimes copy and pasting those catacombs or reusing enemies sometimes outside of the legacy dungeons and so on. And also taking place in the realm of Shadow, which is essentially a dreamscape within inside the fractured mind of a major character, allows them to go to places which are both traditional grimdark fantasy, but also quite like eccentric and imaginative, toying with like color palettes and so on, that we haven't really seen in Elden Ring or a FromSoftware game for that matter. It kind of goes places you wouldn't expect, both mechanically and thematically, while still being that dungeon crawler, but you're constantly like figuring out how to beat enemies, curating your builds, working with other players, doing other like ridiculous stuff. Like when I played during the preview, and that was only 3 hours, I thought I got a decent idea of like how big this new region was or what I'd be doing. I couldn't have been more bloody wrong. Like James is talking about stuff that feels like a different game, like in Slack sometimes.
So you mentioned the setting. Is this like Dragon's Dogma 2's post game? It's like a alternate version of
No,
the.
you kind of find out. There's a place in the base game called Marika's bedroom. Marika's like the god of gods, and it's got these sort of drapes that flow down over her bedchambers. And this land of shadow is essentially where the offcuts, the kind of the embarrassing secrets, the dark stories, they all kind of get thrown away here and cast aside. It's sort of like a almost pocket dimension. You find a tower in the DLC. There's this tower you can climb to the top of, and it says you are standing in the heart of the Land of Shadow. Not the Land of Shadow, the Lands Between. So the Land of Shadow is sort of this central place that's been hidden and sort of buried from sight. Like it is there and it's not there. It's really sort of liminal, and
it's very like alien and dreamlike, to the point where it's familiar when you compare it to the Lands Between and what that was like, both aesthetically and atmospherically. But it feels like ethereal and like liminal, like you said, James. It like reshapes itself throughout the expansion in a way that is both Elden Ring and not. Like there's echoes of like Bloodborne and Demon Souls and other stuff in here, both narratively as well. But I've not got that far. But from what I hear from you, James, it kind of ties in some very interesting stuff later on.
It feels like they took the idea of, I mean, Dark Souls, you have Gwyn, the god of all gods, casts aside his son and they become the nameless king. They're sort of stripped from the annals of history. You don't know who they are. It's this big mystery throughout all of the Dark Souls games is who is Gwyn's lost, forgotten son. And it almost feels like they've taken that idea and blown it up massively, tenfold, because Mesmer kind of fills that role of this forgotten child banished from the Pantheon, sent off to this other land because they sort of went against everything that the gods stood for. I think with the Nameless King, it was they didn't see the whole genocide against dragons as a good thing. They wanted to side with the dragons, help them. And with Mesmer, it's the sort of snake imagery we see with Rykard in the base game.
There's so many snakes. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it feels, I think, a big part of Shadow of the Erdtree is it does look back to Demon Souls even more so than Elden Ring. It looks past all those 10 years that we've spent with different Souls-likes, and it takes the best ideas and it takes them even further than they, I mean, in what I would call masterpieces anyway. I think, the Land of Shadow in itself, it feels like the Dragon Peak where we find the Nameless King, but stretched out across a whole open world. I think it's just, I think it is sort of, it's really corny, but it is like a love letter to all of their past work and all these old ideas that maybe they didn't have the time for, the resources or the vision fully set in stone. It's like they've blown them all up to the way they wanted them in those games.
This is very much a tired discussion when it comes to these kind of games, but you played this on New Game Plus. I played it on New Game Not Plus, so just normal, I guess. But this expansion specifically incorporates 2 new items, the Erdtree Blessings and the Veiled Spirit Ashes. I'm going to be getting that name wrong. Erdtree Fragments, yeah. And the idea is you use these at these sites of grace, and they essentially act as these things that improve the damage you can deal, the damage you can take, the damage that your spirits do, and the damage that you can do while you're riding Torrent, I think. Those are all 4, I think. But I've been using these in drips and drabs when I've been struggling. And I don't know how much you used or how you thought they affected the gameplay, but one of the things we've seen from a few critics, as this embargo is lifted and we've seen more reviews, is this expansion is almost punishing to its detriment. How do you feel about like that as someone who plays a lot of these games?
I don't think I could. I disagreed so much with it being too difficult. I think I went in New Game Plus, and I think if you went into a past FromSoftware game, New Game Plus, that's kind of the end game. You can't progress anymore. You've hit a wall with leveling. Your damage isn't going to get any higher. Damage you take is not going to get any better. Each New Game Plus is designed to be harder and harder and harder to the point where you have to master the game at a certain level. You can't
rely on gear or leveling anymore.
Yeah, you've got to perfect dodging, perfect movesets. It's got to be about patience and skill. And I think to its detriment, that is how New Game Plus all the way up to 7 gets. But in Shadow of the Erdtree with this new leveling system, I never felt that in New Game Plus. It was, I don't know, I was fighting the final boss and taking so many hits. I was not doing perfectly. I was struggling so much to dodge some of those attacks. Like you would nuke the arena at one point, and dodging that was really hard. You had an atomic bomb dropped on you. I felt like with these new items, it was like you were still being able to progress in New Game Plus. I went up to, I think I got to plus 15 by the end with the Scattered Tree Fragments. And I was still taking, I think, 2 or 3 shots to get killed by some of the end game bosses in the DLC.
Okay, that tracks to about where I am then, in terms of the damage I'm taking. That makes a lot of sense, because it feels like in the expansions for like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, it did feel like that in New Game Plus. Like, oh, you can like try leveling and grinding all you like or mastering these bosses, but if you don't master them and you're on this, you're essentially somewhat screwed, and you'd be better off starting a new game and grinding your way up to it instead. But this kind of defeats that, which is good, because it's been 2 years since the game came out, and a lot of people will be going into save files where they're like New Game Plus 4 or whatever, and they won't want to start that journey again.
Yeah, it felt really approachable. I mean, to be completely honest, I'm not great at Souls games. Like Dark Souls 2 took me 300 hours to get through one playthrough with a friend.
Everybody. I'm the same.
Yeah. And I'm using a mimic. I am cheesing where I can cheese. I'm not this great skilled player. But even New Game Plus, like I only struggled with, I want to say 2 or 3 bosses, and they were very end game bosses. I think there are a few leaked ones that people think are the final boss, and they are kind of thematically the final boss of not the main story of Shadow of the Erdtree, but these certain paths that you follow, like the Frenzied Flame and the Fingers. And I was beating them first try on New Game Plus, and I'm not particularly skilled. I don't think it's that hard. I think going back and changing up your build and diversifying with everything you find inside of the DLC, that you can experiment when you get it stuck in a hard place. I think games like Sekiro didn't accommodate for that. And that
Sekiro is really, really bloody hard. Yeah. Like even today, I have not beaten Sekiro because it doesn't give you leeway to try something else. No. It very much just goes, you learn to beat this boss and you get good, or you just don't bother, because you will get a wall in that. Whereas in Elden Ring, it doesn't feel like you ever, if you do hit that wall, there's often a way around it, or a way to circumvent those problems. I think that's like a conversation that's worth having with Souls games these days.
Yeah, I went into Shadow of the Erdtree to bonk my way through it. I had a big stick, and the reason I went into New Game Plus is I wanted to power stance 2 big sticks with a mimic, and I thought that'd be really funny. And I was hitting bosses where sticks did fuck all. You couldn't.
Your bonking strategy didn't work.
No, it didn't. I hit the final boss. I won't spoil who they are, but they would not stagger. They were firing off lasers, nuking, jumping all over the arena and everything, and it was just, I was hitting too slowly. They weren't staggering. It was really difficult. So I went back to the drawing board. I went for a faster dex build with some magic thrown in, and that was a lot more doable. So I think Shadow of the Erdtree, it still builds on Elden Ring's. If you're pushed into a corner, you can go away and do something else. You can go away and change your build. That's still there. There's so much for you to do if you want to do that. I think the fact that if you explore, you find more Scattered Tree Fragments really helps. I wish I hadn't done the final boss so early, because I found this place, there's an altar with like 5 Scattered Tree Fragments at it. You can just, you go away, do the optional stuff, you're going to get stronger, and I think that's never been a thing in a FromSoftware DLC.
How do you feel? One thing that really interested me is how Shadow of the Erdtree immediately throws you into the narrative. Not in a, obviously, linear AAA way, but you were very much, you spawn in the graveyard, you were given one of the very first sites of grace you stumble across has 2 or 3 characters next to it who kind of tell you why they're here, who Miquella is, and they've essentially spread many of their body parts and feelings throughout these golden crosses that you can find throughout the open world. And it's still deliberately quite esoteric and not misleading, but quite cryptic. But it's there's a through line to this narrative that it feels like Elden Ring almost didn't have. Like, you become the Elden Lord and you could read into the different routes and the different characters you meet as much as you wanted. But did you feel like the narrative was more condensed and easy to follow in this, as opposed to Elden Ring?
I think it was refreshingly simple. I think there is so much. Like, I was reading every single item description I found and digging into all these little side stories, and I found that that's still there for the diehards. But it was almost more like Dark Souls, where you jump in the game. I think with Dark Souls, you don't need to go and explore and dig into every little detail to find out what's going on. You just kind of get the gist. Like Dark Souls, it's the world's ending. You can either link the flame to bring it all back to how it was, or let it die out. Like, that's a very basic narrative you can get the grasp of, and you can dig into like why that is and what's happened and all these different opinions on it if you really want to. I think this is very similar, where it's, you're sent to find Miquella, you go and find Miquella. It's very straightforward, and I kind of appreciate that. I think FromSoftware maybe got a little overindulgent in its unreliable narrator, vague storytelling, and it's almost like a return to roots for Shadow of the Erdtree. I was still lost at a lot of parts. Like, I can't lie. I mean, by the end of it, Mesmer's role kind of shifted to the side, and I didn't really understand what was going on with, I don't want to dive into spoilers, but what Michaela was doing by the end. Like, there was still parts where I was lost, but I think that's exciting too, because I think so much of what makes these games great is that you go away lost and you talk to the community and you share what you found when you're digging through the item descriptions, when you're talking to the NPCs. People share their opinions on what they've heard, they share their theories, and you kind of go back and forth until you come across this almost collective idea of what the story is supposed to be, but it's also interpretive. And I think I'm glad there's room for all these different approaches in one place, and I think it's masterful how they balance all of it. It's they've never done it to this level, I don't think.
We touched on this a tiny bit before, obviously with the narrative and like the world design. But how do you feel like the legacy dungeons and such are in this in comparison to the base game? Because to me, they feel a bit more vast and complicated. Like, even some of the optional ones, which used to be catacombs, are now either like lava themed or a bit more vast. Because there's some that you reach the end and you'd expect to just beat a boss and hop on the grace and fast travel out, but in some cases they keep going because as we mentioned at the top, it's like they kind of respected the feedback that we gave them about Elden Ring and went, okay, how can we iterate upon that and do some cool new stuff within the confines of an expansion and not an entire new game? Like, what are some of your like highlights in terms of the levels the expansion lets you explore?
I think, like base game Elden Ring, it got really boring after a while, finding the same catacomb, the same enemies, the same bosses with different names, and you can tell that the open world was maybe too big for what they had in mind, their ambitions. I think Shadow of the Erdtree, condensing everything, you get such detailed little dungeons that are so exciting to explore. I think my favorite one, we've got a TikTok going up on this. You go into a dungeon, you go down this path, and it opens up this massive sprawling cave with giant pots hanging on chains. You delve deeper and you find that the living jaws that we got to know in the base game,
they're so gross,
fleshy things crawling out of them, and it's horrible. But it's like, I think the dungeons, they didn't used to tell a story. That was the problem. It's like Elden Ring and other FromSoftware games, the best thing that they can do with their environmental storytelling is embellish what you read in the item descriptions, that they like flow really well together. I remember watching like a 50-minute breakdown on demon culture in Dark Souls just based on the statues. I think that's what's so good about their storytelling. And you lost all of that in the dungeons. It felt very like Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne. It was just really empty and hollow, and it said nothing. And every single one of them, they were as interesting as finding creepy little jar people that crawl out and scare you. Like, yeah, they're really, I don't know, it's just, there's a personality there that wasn't in the base game, and there's, like you said, you don't always just end up in a boss fight. I think there's they're sort of copy-paste in a similar way to the legacy dungeons, but they've got a bit more thematic role in the story, and that's these like forges. They're these, I think you said the lava ones, they're these giant underground forges ruled by these giants with crystals in their back, and if you explore throughout them all, you don't end up face to face with another big boss fight. You end up in a sort of smithing area where you can get a unique weapon, and I think that's really interesting. It's a change in the formula.
Yeah, it's like a forge you put your hand in and you can be rewarded with like rare materials and stuff, which is not what I expected, because like you, I thought I was going to be a boss at the end of this and then I won't be able to get the loot if I can't beat the boss. Then it just kind of gives you it and then goes, off you go. And I think that's quite cool. It doesn't make combat the end game of a dungeon like that. Exploration is the key, which I think is really valuable, especially for Elden Ring, where honestly I think my favorite parts aren't always the combat or the boss battles. It's like just the pure vibes and the exploration and the environmental storytelling, which once again I feel like a lot of the art design and like the layout of the levels, especially in the legacy dungeons and in the open world, is FromSoftware firing on absolutely all cylinders. It's quite crazy.
I think. Where do you think FromSoft can go from here?
I did think this.
Yeah, because they said that this isn't their like ideal game. They want to go further, and I have no idea how you do that.
I hope it's not Elden Ring 2. I don't know.
No.
I think it would be great, but I'd love them to just do something new like they would with Bloodborne and Sekiro and Elden Ring, like a different kind of fantasy or whatever Miyazaki has has in his mind that he wants to cook up, but because he's clearly not out of ideas, which is quite stunning given the body of work he's done. But also, I'd almost like we've seen the Souls-like formula that FromSoftware debuted over a decade ago now, kind of changed the game in a lot of ways. I'd love to see them continue to iterate upon that formula and take it places where then other developers will take that to different places, because that would be far more interesting than just making another Elden Ring, as good as that would be. Because I don't know, like you called it their magnum opus, but whenever I say that about like a game developer or whatever, it often signals to me that they could still go further, and I think that's arguably the more exciting thing.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways Elden Ring did feel like Dark Souls 4. I know people just feeling like Dark Souls 2 too. And then that in itself is a spiritual successor to Demon Souls, so it keeps feeling like they keep iterating on the same game they've been making since 2009. I think it's really interesting to see how far it's come. Such a simple idea. But I think if I were to look at the future, I would love to see... They used to make survival horror, which I think not many people know. Like back in the PS2 days, they did a game called Kuon, which I think is on par with like Silent Hill. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree has like a little area that's way more amnesia and alien isolation than it is Elden Ring. It's you can't kill the enemies. You have to sneak in the grass. If they get you, they kill you. It's pushing you to play in a completely different way. And I'd love to see what would happen if they took that one area and imagined a whole game where it's survival horror meets Souls-like. Because it's sort of going back to their roots, but building what they've already done, and we see a bit of it in the Erdtree.
And you could absolutely incorporate some of that more mediated combat and environmental storytelling that you get in Elden Ring into a survival horror game, or just an action game with survival horror elements. Because there's stuff here where they venture into that territory. Because I remember when they first teased Sekiro at the Game Awards, a lot of people thought they were going to reboot that old PS2 horror game, which was the one you just mentioned. So why not tap into that Japanese folklore, do something crazy, do something different? Because they have the pedigree and the budget and so on to take those risks that not a lot of other developers would nowadays. Maybe the hardcore Souls people won't love it, but maybe that's what you'd love to see them do.
I think it speaks volumes. I think you look at Armored Core making a comeback, and it's so clear it's not Souls-like, but it draws so much
people
from
still
everything
loved it.
Like, yeah. And it didn't do as well as the Souls-likes, it didn't do as well as Elden Ring, but it was still, I think, the biggest Armored Core, so they have this kind of reputation now where they can dig deep into what they used to do as well as what they are now known for, and I'd love to see them. They have such a varied library. I think it's about time now that they stop just doing Souls-likes, and I think Armored Core 6 signals that.
I know that this expansion introduces a lot of like loot and new abilities, especially some hand-to-hand stuff that was kind of all the rage prior to this coming out. Did you fiddle around with any of that, or are you like me and you kind of stick stubbornly to a dedicated build?
No, I did. I tried Dane's, I think he's called. You get his martial arts kit, and it was really funny. I think it's not a build I'd ever use. I think I respect to use it for about one or two areas just to fiddle around with it. And as fun as it was just jumping in the air and kicking people in the face, it didn't feel as viable. I think that'll be like a funny kind of, like a Twitch stream will go, oh, I punched my way through Elden Ring or something. Doesn't feel like it's a useful, viable build on the same level of some of the others. And I think New Game Plus probably didn't help, but yeah, I did not do enough damage kicking people in the face.
I found that with like the perfume bottles and stuff as well. It's kind of, you'd have like a great sword in one hand and that in the other. It's more of like a zoning tool or something to add to your attack rather than become like a main part of your repertoire, which is cool because I'm very much like play fashion Souls. I don't like go for the high builds in terms of like stats and stuff. I'm like, do I look good and can I do damage? Which one matters more? I don't know. But I'm already like invested in hunting all of that stuff down, getting all the rare souls and going through it again and again to be a completionist in that way. And one thing that we've seen a lot of people mention is this DLC is kind of, if you don't rush through it, it's like the size of a vanilla Souls game. Like, how long did it take you, and what are your takes on like the scope of it in terms of how much there is to do?
Yeah, I rushed to the end because we had 11 days to play it. I was told, Miyazaki was saying, it's 30 to 40 hours long, and I was there.
I
like,
told you
this
personally,
is a Souls game.
just DM.
Yeah, DM me. I was like, oh, this is going to be horrible. Like, this is Souls games. If you get stuck and there's no guides, and you're in this weird period when no one's really leaving helpful messages on the same level. So I was rushing the main story, and I did that in about, I want to say 10 hours. So I managed to get to the final boss and beat them in 10 hours. The side stuff afterwards, I went back and swept it all. Filled the whole map out, did all the areas I could find. We were sort of talking about secret areas we found in our work Slack. I think that would have been about another 30, 35 hours. So
oh wow, okay, it's a beefy plus. Boy.
Yeah, I will say I think it's as big as Dark Souls 1. I think it's better than Dark Souls 1. It's got, I mean, the problem you get with Dark Souls 1 is that the first half is this brilliant all-timer Metroidvania in 3D. It's incredibly detailed. The world is so intricate.
Better chaos and it's fucked.
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah. You meet like the better chaos, then you've got the Tomb of the Giants, and you've got the crappy library where you're walking on invisible bridges, and it's just, I want this to end.
Oh, the invisible library.
You don't have any of that here. Like every area is as good as the last, and I think that's so rare for FromSoftware. I think it's not much of a secret that by the time you get to the back half of their games or the DLC, they usually fall apart. Dark Souls 2's DLC where you meet the invisible tigers, like there's none of that. But it was, like 40 hours, and it didn't feel like 40 hours, though. It was kind of, it's like I would put 9 hours in a day and it would be midnight, and I'd turn to my partner and be like, I thought it was 3 o'clock. Like it was.
I've done that, yeah.
Yeah. But it's manageable. I think that's the important thing. Is I think Souls games, like I said, if you get stuck, it feels like you're trapped. You can't go anywhere. You're sort of, everything's too difficult. You've hit this barrier. What do you do now? I think for Shadow of the Erdtree, it was, I went back to the starting area when I got stuck, and there was a path through a waterfall that led to a completely new area, which led to a completely new area, and it was, there was always somewhere else you could go and fill the time. And even if you do beat the game as quick as I did, not every NPC dies, not every quest ends abruptly. You still can go around and do a bunch of this optional.
Oh, that's good story, because there's some particular moments in the base game, especially, it won't always telegraph a certain decision that might cut off access to characters or quests. Where if that just like, if you beat the final boss, it's like, oh yeah, go back and explore and do all that other shit. That's kind of a huge relief for me, because I'm always constantly paranoid about that stuff.
There is a moment where you basically walk into the final area and it goes, all these NPCs are pissed off at you. And you're like, okay.
Really? It just tells you?
Yeah, you're told, like, this is the final leg, basically, because you do end up fighting some of them. It's kind of like in Elden Ring, where you come face to face with the guy at the round table.
Yeah.
But then you go back and you do the optional areas. There's a guy at the Cathedral of Manus who sends you to ring 2 bells. It's very Dark Souls. He will still be there. Like, I found him after I beat the final boss. You go to the Dragon Peak, and there's this cultist woman who is a dragon in human form, and she's still there to give you her quest. You don't miss out on any of the best side content if you beeline the main story. So if you don't want to be spoiled in the first week, you can just do that and then do everything else, which is refreshing.
I think the first time I played Dark Souls was with the Prepare to Die edition, so it had the expansion and it had all of the quality of life improvements per se that brought. Would you say, as someone, we're 2 years down the line, like if someone came to you and went, should I play Elden Ring now Erdtree is out, would you say now is like the ideal time to jump into that?
Yeah, I think you don't realize, but you look at the launch and you didn't have NPCs on the map. Like, that's such a small quality of life thing now. No, that was an update. There's so much like that, and I think Shadow of the Erdtree takes it even further, where now I'm looking at it like, why wasn't this in the base game? And it's things like, you have the recent items tab where you can see immediately what you found and the exclamation points next to what you've unlocked. I think there's so many items and weapons and armor and gear and things in Elden Ring that it can get lost in the shuffle, and that's such a huge quality of life feature. I also think they've made Torrent more viable. You can now ride him around in the final boss arena. That's way easier.
That was really cool.
Yeah. I think Shadow of the Erdtree as well is full of really useful items, like the scattered fragments, but also taking back into the base game. There's all these new offensive tools you can use, not just weapons. There's sort of new explosive pots. There's new magic spells and healing spells that I think will make it even better for if you're someone who wants to help new players out. I think Elden Ring is more intuitive and more beginner friendly than it's ever been. I think that's the benefit of jumping in now if you start with Shadow of the Erdtree.
I thought I might finally get into it if Destiny was bad, but oops, they actually
Then they
made it really
again.
good. Yeah.
You'll have time. They take a year to make them expansion.
You'd be great at it, Eric.
Yeah, it's definitely on the list. It's just such a huge.
It's daunting.
Thing. Yeah. And I tried Sekiro. I gave up. I love Bloodborne, but I've never completely finished it.
I struggled with Sekiro, so I'm with you there.
Sekiro is really tough. Like, I'd say if you love Bloodborne, there's definitely more in Elden Ring for you than there was in Sekiro.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
Cool. Any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
The game ends with incest, and I won't spoil that.
Oh, hell yeah. But yes, it's pretty spectacular. I've still got a lot to get through in terms of like content, so I'll have to report back to you, James. But it's everything I loved about Elden Ring and more, and I already loved it. And I think that's going to be the takeaway from a lot of people.
Cool. Is this going to be... Do you think that this can be a Game of the Year nominee? Just a DLC?
Yes.
I think Phantom Liberty kind of broke that curse in terms of like them being applicable, both in terms of like content and pricing and their standing. Because in terms of like content, like any other developer or publisher would have just released Erdtree as its own game.
It could have easily been a sequel. I think I saw this today, How Long to Beat, side by side. It's about the same length as God of War, the 2018 reboot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I think that's probably longer than Dark Souls was for a lot of people, so
yeah,
it does feel like its own game.
But it's a good one. Like, I'm almost sad to say goodbye to Elden Ring. Now we know we're only getting the one expansion, but also it's kind of, when you play these games under embargo before release, it's like a wonderfully unique experience, because often you'll play Dark Souls or Bloodborne, and if you get stuck or don't know what an item does, you can just Google it.
Yeah.
But you can't do that now because none of that stuff exists yet. So I think one of the fun retrospective things to do now over the next couple of weeks is just to be kind of like, watch how the community is discovering this stuff, and if they find stuff that we didn't or we did and they're perceiving it in a different way, because that happened with Elden Ring for months after release, that people were still finding new things, and I've got no reason to think that this would be any different.
Yeah, I think that'll definitely happen again, because in the work Slack we were all arguing, how the hell do you fix this broken rune we found?
There's more invisible walls, there's way more.
Yeah. I was hitting every single one of them.
Same. I was proper, if I got stuck in a dungeon, I was like, one of these walls, mate, it's got on me.
Key areas behind.
Alright, very good. Thank you both, and thank you for watching this video. We've got James' full review linked down in the description. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell, and visit us at thegamer.com. That's the